and I heard the man clothed in Skrilla, who was above the plebs and the streamers. He raised his right hand and his left hand towards Esportpools and swore by Thorin himself that there would be fantasy esports and betting for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the NA teams come to an end, all these things would be finished. Not often that you hear the Book of Daniel quoted or paraphrased in fantasy and betting related commercials, but you just did. So the jungler is the most hard done by role in League of Legends in most contexts. So in solo queue, he's always the one to blame. I mean, there's 3 lanes. He can only be in 1 lane at a time. People want him to rescue losing lanes that are behind. Meanwhile, logically, it's usually the better option to snowball winning lanes. The people aren't complaining as it is. People often don't want the jungler to jungle at certain times because they want him to come gank or to come and help them do something, but the jungler needs to on certain occasions, depending on what champion he's playing or where he's at in the game and where the other jungler's at. Even in competitive play, we know it is very difficult to gauge an individual's decisions, and since jungling often isn't about crazy mechanical outplays very often, the decision-making is what you're essentially judging the jungler on, and therefore how well his team does as well. But it's really tough to know what an individual decision was for him relative to what was a call from his team, something communication-related, or a decision that was communicated to him, even more so than players who are playing in lanes, etc. As such, I've always felt like for most of history, the rankings for junglers in the short term are always way off. I mean, almost every single LCS split, particularly NALCS, there's a new talent in the jungle based on having a few hot games by a team who probably have a winning record. And when the team falls off and when he's played a split or the meta changes and he plays a second split, these guys all fall away. They're suddenly no longer all LCS level players or super pros are going to join TSM or whoever else it might be. And all the hype's like, what the hell happened? Because, I mean, that doesn't really happen the same way to AD carries and mid laners, etc. You got to consider when teams lose in competitive play, the junglers look terrible. They obviously get way behind. They get their head smashed in. The ganks don't work. It's super hard to get a lane that's losing back ahead, etc. in competitive play where you can't just abandon people to the same degree. It's also pretty much the only role that gets constantly reset and reinvented almost every single year. They change how wards work and whether you can buy wards and what you can do with wards and how many wards you can hold. They change what camps there are. What type of minions are there? What type of jungle creeps are there? They change the buffs, as they did a couple of seasons ago. So you get different buffs for doing things. You have to relearn the whole game. You can't apply any of your old knowledge or your little tips and tricks you had. They changed the smites, as they did, where they had different smites and different effects. They change items specifically with the jungle in mind, sometimes making them very powerful, like Feral Flare, sometimes making them ridiculously weak, where almost no one uses these things. But that's actually not why this video is titled The Persecuted Jungler. Instead, what I want you to do is let's do a thought exercise, and I'm going to mention a whole bunch of players, and we're going to think of the common trend between them, okay? Because these are all people who at times have been the best or among the best jungle players in their region. And yet, think of how they are thought of. That's what it's going to be, a thought exercise in how jungler isn't just persecuted in solo queue and generally misunderstood or underrated or overrated, but think about how these specific players are treated in their personalities. So, I will dominate. One of the top NA junglers in Season 2, one of the top NA junglers Season 5, banned for a year by Riot Games, could not play in the LCS in Season 3. Think of Linak, one of the best junglers in Europe on the very good Against All Authority team, which faced top 4 at IEM in 2012. One of the few players who could actually stylistically match up with Diamond Procs, also banned. Could not play in the LCS, outright retired. Saint Vicious, now this teddy bear, old uncle figure who people are like, haha, oh, it's just Soul Sent. People forget this guy was super famous during his period in CLG in 2012 for being someone where he was argumentative, or he's someone where he had friction with his teammates, and thus they kicked him out of his team when he was arguably the best jungler in NA. You think of Diamond Procs. Okay, this is a guy where once it all came out what had been going on during the Moscow 5 and Gambit Gaming days, we actually discovered that there were massive intra-team conflicts, hence why Edward left, hence why they had times where they were considering replacing players, partly because of this guy, because he was friends with certain people and didn't like other people and didn't play the same with other people or communicate, or at times people claimed, some of the other teammates, that they felt like he was rude, or there was the whole drama with his girlfriend at the time. He's also, some people didn't like the fact that he seemingly only ganked top, because obviously he was friends with Darian, and for some reason he's always played around ganking top lane. He also did that when he was with Kabashard, when he was in Gambit later on, when some of the other Russian players were gone. You think of, and obviously, by the way, he was famous for trash talking. You think of Svenskeren. Okay, Svenskeren, very talented player who now was obviously criticised for his play. Famously got banned from Worlds, had a fine, had to miss half the games at Worlds, and therefore his team essentially had their chances crippled. You think of Shook, a fantastic solo queue talent, also banned for a year, couldn't play until Season 4. You think of Meteos. Once people actually got to know him, and once his team didn't have like an 80% win rate, all of a sudden people were saying this guy's toxic, or he's a bad teammate, or he just farms too much, he does nothing in the game. Obviously he's had issues with streaming. Then you think of Dardoch. This guy almost, if you to ask the average fan, I bet the first words out of their mouth would be bad teammate. Fantastically talented player, someone who could be the future of NA, but so many teams kicking him out, so many teams don't want to work with him, cite him as a problem. He's considered a bad teammate. You think of Swift, the Korean player who used to play for CJ Frost and went over to Korea and played in, well, newbie more recently, but Chaogu before that. This is another guy who's considered a bad teammate, a toxic asset, someone with attitude problems, essentially behaved like a tyrant, because a lot of star players from Korean teams get kind of the run of the house, as it were, when they join Chinese teams, because they're not going to just waste their investment. So, for example, famously, you may remember that player Tom, who looked pretty promising in SK Telecom. He tried to sign with this team in China that Swift played for. There's a log got leaked where Swift just outright says, like, I'll get rid of this guy, and like fucks him over completely, basically, and also obviously tore the team apart, making them eventually kick Doinby, their mid laner, who, while he, yes, wasn't like a superstar player, he was on some lower level, kind of the high of the Chinese region, because he was this Korean player who could kind of play this kind of support carry type mid lane style and seemed to do very well in team fights and understand what he was doing very well. And yet Swift had him kicked off the team, and it certainly looked terrible from the way that all came out. Now, yes, in each instance, there are aspects to these players that are clearly negative components, and there are things they have done that aren't excusable or should probably be punished on some level. But the sheer number of these players, who are all very good players, and yet are all associated with these negative qualities. And yet you think of positions like mid lane or AD carry or top lane, you'd be hard pressed to find as many that are so good that have these ridiculous reputations one way or another hanging around them. Well, here's the question. Is it some coincidence that these people are all considered in negative terms or had negative components attached to their reputations at a certain time? Because here's the funny thing. I once asked a very famous jungler about this exact topic, and what he told me is what I want you to think about here. He said it's actually the same as when you play in solo queue. When you play in teams, people blame you non-stop. So first of all, when you're in solo queue and you're a pro jungler, you're going to get reported a lot more. You're going to get no arguments a lot more, and therefore reported for the arguments. The thing you've typed with the arguments a lot more. People are going to shit talk you a lot more from the other team, and therefore your number of reports in a solo queue game, which if you're a pro could get you banned one day, will be massive compared to someone who just plays top lane and wins or loses, talks a little bit of shit, but generally people just let him do what he does in his lane. Then you've got to factor in that because they get blamed so much on a pro level, and not as much on a pro level, obviously, but on a pro level and in solo queue, they get into fights more, as I said, and therefore the opportunity is there, especially if they're people who are decisive, like a lot of junglers are, and certainly want to win the game and feel like their lanes aren't doing things. The fight is not just going to be one-sided. It's going to be a brawl, isn't it? They also get judged off the strength of their lanes. Therefore, they're pent up, they're angry, they're aggressive because people are saying they're shit because they have laners that are terrible or can't play the game a certain way, or need babysitting, or need extra help, or need to be getting out of jail. And you can't just abandon these guys at pro play. They also get blamed for macro decisions, even when they didn't make the macro decision, or their teammate gave them inappropriate information, or their teammate gave them inaccurate information, or didn't tell them that someone planted a ward there and they've just wasted 2 minutes of their path waiting in this brush here for someone to come back, or they've dove incorrectly when the rest of the team didn't communicate that the jungler was not spotted bot side, for example. There's all sorts of aspects that go with it, and so you end up with these players who on solo queue and in these aspects are considered toxic, and in team environments are considered toxic, and constantly so many of them have these terrible reps. You think of the players who have the spotless reps who are junglers. Like, they tend to be people who are the most extreme example of someone who'd never have any problems. They're so laid back. They're just semi-doormats at times who are just there. They live to serve the rest of the team and do things for other people. Or sometimes they're just super nice guys. They're just wonderful people that just don't have any kind of aggression in them or any kind of a, let's say, contentious attitude. But there seems to be no in-between. If you're a very good player, you either go to one of those extremes or the other. There are so few that are any kind of happy medium. And I just want people to think about this, not just in solo queue aspects, but when we think about pro players who are junglers, and especially the junglers who get a bad rep from fans or from how they play in solo queue, there's more to it. There is a level to which they're hard done by as junglers in a way that the other roles aren't. And we can't judge all players equally as though a top laner, a jungler, and a support were all playing exactly the same game with the exact same circumstances.